Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. My name is Bastian Gigerich. I'm the Director for Defense and Military Analysis at the IISS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's book launch, Blood, Metal, and Dust: How Victory Turned into Defeat in Afghanistan and Iraq, featuring our very own Senior Fellow for Land Warfare, Ben Barry, who will speak for about 20 minutes or so about his book, a good-looking publication, if I may say, and then we will have a Q&A session. I should make a couple of housekeeping points. The first one about how you can engage. There are two options. You can open the Q&A window where you can type in a question or comment. If you can keep it fairly brief so that it's easy for us to digest and respond to, that will be helpful. We will then go through this and see where we like to pick things up, possibly group a little bit. There's also the possibility of raising your electronic hand, and that way you can alert me that you are seeking the floor, and I will then call on you to ask your question, and the default mode for that will be audio only. I think you will be able, though, to turn on your camera should that be desirable and appropriate. The other thing I'd like to mention is that we are recording the webinar because we would like to post it on the IIS webpage afterwards. So do keep that in mind as you are making your remarks. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, dominated international politics in the first decade of the 21st century. They are still a very emotionally charged theme, and there are rather rich lessons for current and future armed conflict in them. And Ben has looked at these and studied these in some depth. And of course, his analysis benefits from his experience in the British Army, in the British MOD, and now from a good decade at the IISS. And in his research work here, he has, of course, worked on those themes as well. Some of you will have read his 2017 Adelphi book called Harsh Lessons: Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Changing Character of War. So Ben will speak for about 20 minutes, up to 20 minutes. We will then have Q&A. It is a sizable publication, so Ben will only be able to give us a couple of highlights and points that he has pulled out from the overall assessment and analysis. But that does not mean we have to restrict our conversation to those points. Ben is happy to take questions on other issues that he just won't have time to fit into his presentation as well. So with that, Ben, I will go quiet and hand it over to you. We're looking forward to your remarks, Ben.
Thanks, Bastian. War's a terrible thing. I had walk-on parts in the wars in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, and Afghanistan, showing me the cost in blood, treasure, social fabric, and economies. I've also attended too many military funerals. So we must learn from war, none more so than national security and defense, diplomatic and development establishments, armed forces and defense industry. And it's very good to see so many people with those backgrounds in today's audience. I'm sure that those in the audience who participated in these wars and have well-earned medals to show it would agree that learning painful lessons requires the humility to take them on the chin. Forgive me if I'm sometimes outspoken. Whilst there are good accounts by journalists, many written in near real time, there's a growing number of good memoirs and some useful official reports like the British Iraq Inquiry, the US Army's excellent history of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and a very good Norwegian government report on their role in Afghanistan. I saw a need for a military history of both wars from 9/11 to the present, analysing military lessons. So that's why I wrote the book. As the printed version is 520 pages and the audio book on Audible is 21 hours long, I'd best be brief. There were campaigns, operations, and battles that are pregnant with lessons for today. And one example of this is the current debate in the UK about the relevance of tanks and armoured vehicles. Now, I assess that these had very high utility in Iraq, where British and US armoured divisions were decisive in 2003, and heavily protected armoured vehicles also had significant effect in the stabilisation operations in both wars and the high proportion of fighting in urban areas, including in Baghdad, Basra, Fallujah, and Sadr City. So I fought to explain how the wars took the contours they did, including battles that deserve broader understanding. I make some judgments. I judge, for example, that if any actor won the Iraq war, it was Iran, who achieved more of its strategic aims than the US and UK did, as set out in IISS's recent dossier on Iran's networks of influence. I also assess that on the current trajectories in Afghanistan, the Taliban are more likely to succeed than the Kabul government, the US or NATO. I also judge that of all the generals who led troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, Iran's General Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's Quds Force, was the most successful. I saw inadequate strategic leadership by national leaders and their governments, defense ministries, and forces chiefs. And I also saw contributory factors that included weaknesses in intelligence and understanding, reconstruction efforts, political strategies, military operational concepts, tactics, and equipment. These, combined with failures to adapt quickly enough to unforeseen circumstances, provided opportunities that were rapidly exploited by insurgents and militia. The story starts before 9/11 by explaining the experiences of the UK and US forces in the previous 25 years, including their deliberate neglect of counterinsurgency. I see the campaign that the US improvised after 9/11 in Afghanistan, which combined the CIA, air-deployed special forces, precision bombing, and the militias on the Northern Alliance on the ground as highly successful, as, for example, was the then Brigadier Mattis's 2001 long-range insertion of US Marines into Kandahar, the most ambitious amphibious operation of recent times. Also successful was the deployment of a British-led multinational force, the International Security Assistance Force, to Kabul, although subsequent US attacks on Tora Bora and Operation Anaconda were problematic. The international effort in Afghanistan had wide international support, but the US decision to attack Iraq diverted most military, intelligence, development, and government attention from Afghanistan to Iraq, and it imposed a fatal opportunity cost on efforts to stabilize and reconstruct Afghanistan. Regime change in Iraq had been thoroughly planned and drew upon well-trained and led modern air-land forces to defeat less modern Iraqi forces that were poorly trained and led. There are battles to learn from, which include the highly innovative CIA and Special Forces joint operation in Kurdistan that also incorporated a parachute brigade and air-landed armor, the US capture of Baghdad, and the British attack on Basra, which was a 21st century siege that captured a city without flattening it. But post-conflict stabilization of Iraq descended into chaos, directly as a result of decisions made and not made by President Bush, Secretary Rumsfeld, and Ambassador Bremer, as well as the disgraceful abuse of prisoners by US and British troops. These all fatally damaged the legitimacy of the Iraq war, including within NATO member states. So this created cross-contamination that made it very difficult for many to fully commit to the war in Afghanistan. In Iraq, it took several years for the US and the UK to recognize that the ends, ways, and means being employed were inadequate, and the US recognized this more than the UK did. US adaptations were eventually made, including the 2007 surge, that created sufficient security for limited political progress that was then subsequently reversed by Prime Minister Maliki, who acted as the midwife for ISIS. My story then switches to Afghanistan. I look not only at how the British got bogged down in Helmand, but also at Operation Medusa, the Canadian-led brigade attack in Panjwai in 2006. I also look at the nearly victorious Taliban attacks on small British bases in Helmand in 2006, and similar attacks on isolated US bases in eastern Afghanistan in 2008-2009. These were all desperate sieges, the defenders only surviving through extensive use of airstrikes dangerously close to their positions. Now, great bravery and determination was displayed by US troops, British troops, and by Taliban fighters, which reminds us of the enduring value of morale, fighting spirit, and combat leadership, as well as military training. I assess President Obama's Afghan surge and the problematic subsequent transfer of the war to Afghan leadership. The weakness of the Afghan government and its forces were demonstrated by the 2015 Taliban capture of the city of Kunduz. I also show how the government position in Helmand province has greatly weakened, with most of the province now under Taliban control. I'll talk about lessons I've identified. One was that the ferocity of the armed opposition was a strategic shock to the US, and even more so to many of its allies. Against opponents determined to fight, international forces who couldn't fight or whose governments wouldn't let them fight were of little utility, adding military and political friction. This reaffirms that combat is the core military capability, and armed forces need to be benchmarked against determined and capable enemies. Now, force had wide utility for the regime change campaigns and for counterinsurgency. It also had great utility for the militias and insurgents fighting to further their political aims, and for Iran. I conclude that war is a multidisciplinary activity requiring integration of all activities at all levels. This applies not only to combined arms military tactics in rural and urban terrain, it also applies to the considerable improvements made during the wars in integrating US and NATO air power and land forces, and also integrating special forces and conventional forces, as well as the integration of all types of intelligence from tactical to strategic. It also applies to fully integrating all levers of national power, military, intelligence, diplomatic, and development, for example. So both wars illustrate the importance of achieving unity of effort. In Afghanistan, the Taliban insurgency often achieved greater political and military unity of effort than the Afghan government and the US and many of its allies. And the weaknesses of the US and allied side was often conspicuously due to failing to achieve adequate levels of integration of military with civilian action. And Iran was much better at this in Iraq than the US and UK. And a year ago, we set this out in the case study on Iraq in the IISS's dossier on Iran's networks of influence, on which I've drawn. Iran's Quds force combines irregular warfare, special forces, clandestine networks, capacity building, forming and leading proxy forces from insurgent cells to large militias. It also combines propaganda and political action, including buying influence with cold cash. It has a seat on Tehran's National Security Council and sets Iran's policy for Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. It often provides the Iranian ambassadors to those countries. Effectively, it's a standing interagency task force from which I believe the US and its allies have much to learn. Now, the wars were often characterized by British officers as armed politics. And I think the prolonged and difficult counterinsurgency campaigns were essentially contests for the mind of people, the populations, the insurgents, the militias, and their military and political leadership. And there was a political dimension to military operations, often right down to the tactical level, something I'd seen for myself in Northern Ireland and the Balkans. Now, I use several examples and vignettes that illustrate this, including the work of US civilians, Carter Malkasian in Helmand province and Douglas Grindle in Kandahar. The interpenetration and the interdependence of war and politics was amplified through 21st century communications, not least Al Jazeera. And all this increasingly accelerated passage of information of various degrees of truth, rumor, or lies, the battle of the narrative. To conclude, for those grappling with the challenges of understanding and conducting current and future wars, I hope my book's analysis of campaigns and battles that we can learn from, but also of the themes of armed politics, the battle of the narrative, an analysis I do of linear and non-linear war, and also military adaptation and learning under fire, might also think through some of these wicked problems. Of course, an alternative might be to take the writings of Clausewitz, and lay on top of them the writings of Hobbes, Machiavelli, and Sir Rupert Smith, and then lay on top of those box sets of the television sets of House of Cards and Game of Thrones, and put them all together in an industrial blender. But my book is a bit cheaper. And I'll just conclude by saying that the publishers Osprey, some of whom's excellent staff are with us today, are offering a 20% discount on purchase of the book from their website using a code BMD20. And I'll happily now, Bastian, take questions on any aspect of both wars, including the many I've not mentioned this morning.
Ben, thank you very much. That was admirable in both brevity and precision. So that leaves us a good 45 minutes for discussion. So that is really very good. We have to close on time to let some of us move on to a second event that starts at 1 p.m. UK time, namely the US ambassador to NATO speaking. Ben, there are a couple of points that I want to pick up, but I see questions already piling in, and people are raising their blue hands. So instead of abusing my privilege here, I will go to some of the questions. We have some raised blue hands, and we'll have a couple of typed up questions in the Q&A element. So I'll mix and match. If I can first, please go to one of the blue hands and ask Mungo Melvin to give us his comment and question.
Thank you, Ben, for a wonderful presentation. I've not yet had the privilege of reading your book, but being an Osprey author, look forward to seeing it and hearing your views again on this. But my question is, what do you believe are the principal obstacles to learning, military learning, particularly amongst the military leadership, apart from the lack of humility? What are they? Are they structural or personal, or is it lack of training, or is it cultural? Perhaps you could comment on that, please.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. And I might add to that, Ben, Simon Englam has asked on the Q&A function, why were the US and British forces so slow to learn from their experience in these wars? So those two, Mungo's question and that one, go together. So perhaps you can tackle that learning. I don't know whether you want to put it under learning under fire but that set of issues, if you could let us know what you think about those.
Well, thanks very much, Simon and Mungo, for those excellent questions. There's a whole chapter in the book called Learning Under Fire that has a number of case studies where of successful adaptation, and also attempts to analyze the barriers to adaptation and learning. I think the US and British military had become blinded by their successes in the Balkans, Bosnia and Kosovo, and also blinded to a certain extent by the rapid success of the regime changes in Afghanistan and Iraq. Add to this that the US had chosen to walk away from counterinsurgency, but most of the army had. The special forces and the US Marines were a slight exception, because as they modernized themselves for the Cold War after Vietnam, they felt we'd had enough of this counterinsurgency. We don't want to do counterinsurgency again. We want to go back to big war. And I think there'd also been a degree of complacency resulting from the successes in the Balkans, where people didn't really analyze their successes critically and look at what the enemy might have done to make things more difficult. I think you've also got that many in the British and UK military establishments were mesmerized by the revolution in military affairs. Now, I saw much of the RMA arguments going on, and the proponents of it were very clear, but they very rarely looked at how the RMA might help with irregular warfare. And I think there was far too much in the early years of both wars in Washington, DC and London of people wanting to be in the war they wanted to be in, rather than realizing the situation had changed enough and they were now in something completely different.
Ben, thank you very much. Let me pick up 2 points raised by Jonathan Marcus. Jonathan is asking, the first issue is, are the lessons of interagency coordination that you refer to equally important for gray zone for the gray zone conflicts of the future? So do they travel, in other words? And second part of Jonathan's intervention, and maybe you can take both of them together. How do we retain counterinsurgency lessons as we shift focus to a great power competition environment? So both aspects of how enduring is this, what we have seen, but take it in both directions of future gray zone conflict and great power competition and possible conflict. Ben.
Jonathan's first question, absolutely. If we look at recent grey zone conflicts like Ukraine, Syria, the rise of ISIS, and also the challenges that China poses to stability in the South China Sea, they're inherently interagency. You know, there's a military dimension, there's a battle of narrative dimension, there's an economic dimension, propaganda dimension, intelligence dimension. So interagency coordination is absolutely essential from this. And I think we need to learn. We need to learn from the success of Quds Force. We also need to learn from the success and weaknesses of Russian and Chinese efforts. And I can't help noting that Russia has set up a national command center where all agencies of government are actually represented, looking at operations from an interagency way. I think it's absolutely the case that what the Brits called the comprehensive approach, what Sir Mark Sedwill called fusion doctrine, I think you know, that is certainly part of the solution. I'm sorry, I've slightly forgotten Jonathan's second question.
The taking those lessons into a great power conflict environment and whether they're enduring in that context as well, from your point of view.
Well, history suggests that great power conflict can arise as a result of a hybrid conflict. Secondly, there have been great power conflicts that have had considerable hybrid, grey zone, and threshold warfare dimensions. For example, the 7 Years' War in America, aspects of the First World War, and particularly the Second World War. I think there's a broader point for militaries, that militaries, no matter how narrowly their defense policy prescribes their operational role and sets their priorities, the officers, the leadership of the militaries, and also the civilian leadership of things like defense ministries, need to be educated in breadth and depth about the whole spectrum of conflict. One of the astonishing things about the British Armed Forces was that in 1999, as they set up a joint staff college, that joint staff college largely deleted the considerable body of training in education in insurgency and counterinsurgency that had been a feature of the Army Staff College. And it was some best part of a decade before that was reinserted. That might explain why so many Brits struggle to get their heads around counterinsurgency quickly enough.
Ben, thank you. Let me pick up one or two more from the Q&A typed questions before then moving back to the raised hand, so to speak. The next question I'd like you to pick up on is from Desmond Bowen, congratulating you on a great presentation, but then saying, I wonder about the use of the word victory in the title. Other than in the initial phases, the campaigns were not about the imposition of a political settlement, Desmond argues. Maybe that was the problem. Rupert Smith said that force could do no more than provide a platform for political actors to do their work, in which they failed massively and continue to do so. So this leads to the question from Des, should Western governments move to a more authoritarian and brutal imposition of a solution?
Very good question, Desmond. And of course, I recognize that you're one of the people in the audience who had a certain amount of skin in the game. Well, Desmond, you're right. And the US and the UK initially set very ambitious strategic objectives for Iraq and Afghanistan, which they then, in a measured way, reduced as those strategic objectives looked like they were going to be more difficult to achieve. I compare the outcome in Iraq with the published US national military strategy for Iraq in 2005, and what the US and allies and its allies achieved falls a great way short of that. But I think we should be absolutely clear that in terms of increasing its influence in Iraq and also bolstering its financial interests, Iran succeeded. Now, I accept that it's very difficult for democratic countries to engage in what might be seen by their media as brutal repression. But there's no doubt that there were times in Iraq and Afghanistan when the use of force in quite some strength was decisive in achieving political effect. For example, there's a little known campaign in the UK known as the 1st Armoured Division's Extension Campaign. 1st Armoured Division was extended in Iraq to deal with the Shia uprising in the Shia provinces south of Baghdad. And it had to use quite considerable amounts of force to deal with the Shia militias. It was successful in this, and for a while, it restored a degree of stability in Najaf and Kabul and those areas. General Richard Sheriff is on the record as saying that when he took over in Basra, he found that British troops were being too cautious and were sometimes firing 4 rounds when they should have been firing 400. Now, quite clearly, it's a difficult strategic balance, but we were dealing in both countries with actors that respected the use of force.
Ben, thank you. And I'm going next to the question from Dr. Frank Hoffman, not only to reward him for getting up early, but also because it is a very good question that follows on from some of the things that you have already touched upon. And Frank, who I assume is in DC at the moment, says he particularly agrees with your assessment, Ben, about Iran's influence and its indirect combinational or hybrid approach. And so a minute ago, Ben, you talked about great power competition, and I think you alluded to, and that was also part of Frank's question, that many competitions are actually, including many great power competitions, are actually framed by proxy conflicts. And so Frank's question is, are we truly aware of how to best counter proxy wars? Ben?
I think there are a lot of clues out there. I'm not sure that Western defense and security establishments have picked them all up. You know, the most effective proxy war waged as part of this was Iran's use of proxies in Iraq. And actually, there's very good analysis of this in the excellent US Army official history of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And it's a combined arms and it's an interagency process. Actually, the West has been quite good at this in the past. I offer, for example, the arrangements made for support to resistance movements in Europe, where at theatre level, there were proper combined joint headquarters to support resistance movements. Now, that's often seen in the Western military as a task for special forces, and it's the traditional role of the US Army's Green Berets. But there's much more to that. There's also air and naval forces. There's a political dimension and a propaganda dimension, and even a development dimension. And I think that this was understood in the Mediterranean and Europe in 1944-45. I'm not sure it's understood now. There's another example to look at in my book, which is the work that was done initially by the CIA and then supported by US Special Forces in Kurdistan, where the CIA went in a year in advance, set up a human intelligence network, worked closely with the Peshmerga intelligence, effectively a joint Special Forces task force of a Special Forces group, and also its integral support from the US Air Force was brought in to help deliver this. And as the war started, the 173rd Airborne Brigade was parachuted in, and armor and US Marines were also air landed. And that is the sort of approach that I think you need if you want to wage proxy warfare, but also if you want to counter it. I don't think there's a silver bullet. Well, there is a silver bullet. It's combined interagency approach to dealing with hybrid warfare and proxy warfare.
Ben, thank you. I want to now turn back to the list of raised hands. So if we can please have Yogendra Kumar, please.
Thank you. First of all, I want to congratulate Brigadier Ben Berry, whom I had the good fortune of meeting in Delhi, and congratulate him for this book. I actually benefited a great deal in writing my book, which has just come out by Routledge, on his writing IISS publication on study of Iran, Iraq and Afghanistan. So my question basically is this: reading that particular book, which is very insightful, is the failure of all these campaigns to actually create a political system in these two countries, which would be stable and resilient, and actually in a way which would actually be responsive to the needs and the aspirations of the community, the grassroots level. And that problem you find, in particular, in the case of Iraq, the dissolution, the Ba'ath Party, in the early phases, as soon as the campaign was over, the initial campaign, and also in the case of Afghanistan, when no party system actually was created, as a result of which all these security operations carried out, they finally actually have led really to practically, as I said, very little impact now. And the paradox now, of course, is that as a result of failure of these two projects in Iran, in Iraq and Afghanistan, it is Iran which emerged actually as the most, I would say, a very important and influential force in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll take the opportunity to connect the question you just got, Ben, to another one asked on the Q&A function, where Anthony Dimmock asks, was there any viable model for integrated capacity building, democratization, and the shrinking, as he put it, of the narco state in Afghanistan? So that I think you can connect those two perhaps and take those on, Ben.
Well, those are really penetrating questions, and of course, much of the difficulty in both countries was that political actors behaved in ways that many Western actors found very difficult to deal with, and we shouldn't have been surprised at that. I think there's an important counterfactual, which is, what if there hadn't been an invasion of Iraq? Because if there hadn't been an invasion of Iraq, it's quite possible that the US could have led an international effort in Afghanistan that actually helped the country get itself forward. Now, it would have required accepting that the nature of governance in Afghanistan is very different from a Western democracy. But it does seem, in retrospect, that many of the Western efforts that were made, including many civilian efforts, assumed they were going to turn Afghanistan into a Jefferson democracy on a shining hill. I think, though, in my book, there are some vignettes that showed that at the local and tactical level, progress could be made. And I commend to you the account I have of Carter Markasian's work in Garmsir project, which is based on a book he wrote about it, War Comes to Garmsir. And what Markasian shows, it was that as a US political officer working with the US Marines, he could use the hard power of the Marines and development money and basically political decisions to persuade local actors to move their behavior from being a negative actor to a positive actor. And that shouldn't have been a surprise, because there were many NATO military successes in Bosnia and Kosovo that achieved exactly that effect. I'd also offer the experience of Douglas Grindle working in Kandahar province towards the tail end of the US surge, where in Dan district, he was able to do the same in cooperation with a particularly effective district governor. Now, as there are tactical examples that show this can work, it's for consideration that if a similar approach had been applied at the national level, we might have got further forward. I'd also say that I drew on some excellent reports by SIGAR, the US Special Investigator for Afghanistan, on Afghanistan reconstruction and development, that really have some very useful case studies of what worked and what didn't. But I think we need to learn from what worked.
Ben, thank you very much for those answers. Next on my list is a question from Thomas Duffy. And it's a question that relates to both Iraq and Afghanistan. And he asked, does your book look at the importance of articulated war aims and how they change over time? Does it appear that the war aims for both conflicts changed over time? And did those changes make a difference in the outcome? So if you could let us know how you look at that in the context of your book and what your thoughts are on it, please, Ben.
I didn't look at the detail of the decision making in Washington DC and London on the decision to go to war. That's a book in itself, and it's been very well covered by others, and indeed by the British Iraq inquiry. I think, though, that in the case of Washington DC, it's very difficult to be charitable about that decision making in 2003, 2004, and the decision making around the table in the National Security Council up to 2006. Although, you know, I give credit to President Bush for deciding to reject the majority of advice he was being given by the national security establishment at the end of 2006 and go for the decision to surge. And actually, I think it's fairly and honestly described in President Bush's own memoir. What I also analysed, though, was the US decision-making in terms of President Obama's decision to commit to the Afghan surge. And I'm very pleased to have learned over the last couple of weeks that the assessment I made is coherent with what President Obama says in his own memoir. And that's a very good case study of a leader that has to take a very difficult decision, working himself up and building the understanding he needs to make that decision. Now, Thomas makes the point that the war aims were malleable. As the wars went on, the war aims got less ambitious. And certainly towards the latter stage of the Afghan war, British officers would use the term Afghan good enough for the effects they were trying to achieve with their training of the Afghan security forces. These things happen. We have to accept they happen. And to a certain extent, ratcheting down war aims to what is achievable is proper responsible behavior by strategic leaders. You know, that's part of what strategic leaders are paid for, what presidents, heads of government, military chiefs, members of national security councils are paid for. There's no doubt that as the seriousness of the situation in both countries impressed itself on strategic leaders, they did take more care about making better decisions.
Ben, thank you. Shifting gears slightly in terms of the direction of questions, I'd like to turn to one that was posed by James Chandler of King's College London. And it's a very brief but penetrating question. Was the British Army defeated in Basra, in your view?
Almost. I should say that my last job in the British Army was writing its final lessons learned from Iraq. including the whole issue of the unsatisfactory outcome in Basra and why it happened. We have to be absolutely clear that although much of British military history is glorious, there are some very stark defeats, the greatest of which, in my judgment, is the fall of Singapore. What happened in Basra is not of that magnitude. The Iraq inquiry concluded that the British withdrew with their strategic aims largely unachieved, and they had to enter into a humiliating deal with the Shia militia to reduce their casualties in Basra. I'm not quite as stark as that. British strategy almost failed, but failure was averted at almost the last safe moment, largely because of the efforts of the Iraqi army, supported by US mentors and US air power. And actually in the book, and also in an earlier article in the IISS journal Survival, I've set out that the principal reason for this was weaknesses in British strategy and the formulation and execution of British strategy.
Thanks, Ben. There's a follow-up to this, asking if you take the same question and look at Helmand, what would your judgment be with regards to British Army in Helmand?
I set out in the book how, for admirable motives, the British committed to lead NATO in Afghanistan in 2006, and along with Canada and the Netherlands, decided that they should attempt to stabilize Helmand on behalf of the Afghan government. But how, partly because of inadequate understanding and over-optimistic planning, they suddenly found themselves in a desperate situation. I mean, we should be absolutely clear that some of those sieges of platoon houses in Helmand could have resulted in British defeats, and were it not for air power, artillery and satellite communications, my judgment is the Taliban could have overrun some of those bases, as they so nearly overrun a couple of American bases in eastern Afghanistan. But it's fair to say that Canada and the Netherlands also found themselves in much more difficult situations in Kandahar and Uruzgan provinces than they'd thought they would find. The problem with British strategy between 2006, 2009 was that there was one set of forces, and the British chose that they could only build up in Helmand as they drew down in Basra. And of course, they weren't able to draw down in Basra as quickly as they planned to. But there is a wider issue. Britain did not display as much national military mobilization as the United States. United States troops went to Iraq and Afghanistan much more frequently. There was a higher degree of mobilization by the reserves. There was much more urgency in increasing capabilities like drones to give them that intelligence advantage. The other thing the US did was when Robert Gates became US Defense Secretary, and he's probably the most successful and certainly the most important defense minister in the whole story of these two wars. When Robert Gates became US Defense Secretary, he said, the Army and the Marine Corps aren't big enough. We haven't got enough ground forces. So he immediately persuaded Congress to authorize a significant increase in the size of the Army and the Marine Corps and the budget to support that. This is in stark contrast to the British, who in 2004, probably buoyed by the success of the initial interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also because of budgetary cuts imposed by then Finance Minister Gordon Brown, decided to reduce the size of their armed forces and didn't reverse this reduction. So, you know, part of the self-inflicted difficulty the British had in Basra and Helmand was that they mobilized themselves less than the Americans did, and sometimes were surprised that the Americans were disappointed in this.
Thank you, Ben. Just to let everybody know, we're entering the last 15 minutes or so of this webinar. So if you want to get your questions in, it's probably now a good time to either raise your hand or type them up. We have a couple still in the pipeline, but I think we might still be able to take maybe one or two more. Ben, if I can just ask one that was on my list. You earlier said we must, of course, learn, focus on learning from what worked primarily. But can you say a few words about what lessons should not be drawn from these wars? What are the false positives, and what are just perhaps the misleading lessons that some people might think they've learned? What would you point out in that area?
Very good question, Bastian. Of course, this is directly relevant to the military challenges of NATO forces that seek to deter Russia in Eastern Europe, or indeed the forces of US and its allies in the Pacific. The first one is air superiority. The US and its allies benefited hugely from air superiority, and although some helicopters and some drones were sometimes shot down with loss of life in the case of the helicopters, by and large, the insurgents, militias, and the Taliban didn't have effective air defenses, and they didn't have much in the way of combined arms. They didn't have much in the way of armored vehicles. They didn't have much in the way of artillery, and they, that was an advantage that the US and its allies had over them. So you're fighting largely an infantry force, which is very good at fighting in urban areas and in the close terrain, for example, of the Green Zone and the orchards of Panjwai. But it's not like fighting a Russian motor rifle brigade, for example. The next thing is logistics and basing. Massive bases, all countries had them, and they're able to put on them things like post-exchange shops and coffee bars and Pizza Huts. And those, although they got rocketed and people were killed and injured by rocket attacks, they were not faced with the sort of indirect fire threat and the air threat you'd have in a conventional war. So you'd need logistics, which is capable of dispersing and adapting around air and rocket and missile threats. You also had secure sea lines of communication. I probably don't say enough about in the book about sea power. I say something, but sea power had decisive effect, particularly US carriers and the ability of their amphibious shipping with embarked Marines to project power ashore. And if there's one lesson that I don't see talked about enough outside the US Marine Corps, who are rightly proud of this, it's the very imaginative way in which the then Brigadier Mattis projected his Marine Expeditionary Brigade from the Indian Ocean into Kandahar province in 2001. But I do think many of the lessons, particularly as Jonathan Marcus said, about how you combat hybrid grey zone and proxy war, and particularly the need for a combined interagency approach, such as fusion doctrine, are directly of relevance to the full spectrum of conflict.
Ben, thank you very much. I'm going to change the order a little bit in the order that I wanted to go in now. Change it a little bit because of where you just ended, and pick up one of Desmond Bowen's other questions. And you just mentioned a fusion doctrine and a couple of other things. And Des is asking, do you see the recently published integrated operating concept in the UK as the learning of the lessons you speak of and the promotion of an all-government engagement approach in the gray zone and beyond? So is that, how far does that go in encapsulating those lessons that you've talked about? If you could give us your assessment, please.
Credit to the UK CDS General Carter and the British military, but there's a lot to find on the web on this British integrated operating concept. A talk General Carter gave, and also the concept is there, or rather a summary of it is. it's very clear, and with regard to many of the lessons of Iraq, Afghanistan, and also more recent conflicts, I see a lot of merit in what's in the integrated operating concept. There's one thing that raises my eyebrows in that there's a page on capability implications, and it basically says we will trade out hard physical protection for increased stealth and mobility. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that without heavy protected armored vehicles, there'd have been a lot more British, US and NATO casualties and operations against an enemy that was very capable of fighting, had lots of RPGs and lots of roadside bombs. Without those heavily protected armored vehicles, those operations would have been slower and there would have been more coalition casualties. There's a lot in the integrated operating concept about permanent engagement with partners and allies and supporting them in their own conflicts and also helping them build their capacity. That all makes sense. There were some successes and initial failures in capacity building in Iraq and Afghanistan, which I do cover in the book. What I see is the US Army and the British Army have adapted to do this. The US Army has formed dedicated security force assistance brigades, which have been doing turn and turn about in Afghanistan, working with the Afghan forces, including providing tactical advisors up close and personal on the ground. The British have formed a specialist infantry group to do exactly the same thing. What I don't see, though, is the same effort in navies and air forces. I don't see the Royal Air Force deploying something that looks like the Specialist Infantry Group or the Royal Navy, and I don't see the US Air Force and US Navy doing so either. One of the points I make in the book, it's a case study almost, is that it took far too long to build the capacity of the Afghan Air Force, and basically work started on it too late. The US Air Force put a hell of a lot of effort into growing the Afghan Air Force. I think the Royal Air Force's contribution was a single education officer teaching English as a foreign language.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to, just because we are close to running out of time, I'm going to group a few questions together for like a final run at it, as it were. So if you can get your pen ready, Ben, I'm going to try and get 4 things in now. One is, let me see, where did it go? Here we go. One is from Salma Malik. And the question is, and I know, Ben, you this is from me now. I know you don't mind a bit of counterfactual analysis. So the question is, if one could wind back the clock, how could we turn this defeat into victory? So the key points you would make that you think would have changed the course and were within reach, as it were. So let's take that one on. Then a second one is from Paul Schulte. And the question is, how much went wrong because of a fundamentally erroneous, unanalyzed, unaffordable, and unsustainable doctrine, which he then describes as transformative nation building, COIN, competing to offer services to huge populations, which could not be protected by available Western forces. So, and how far was that the fundamental flaw in your view? And let me see, what else can we get in here? And then one question that again takes you in a very different direction, but I'd be interested to hear whether you have any thoughts on it. There's a question from an attendee. I unfortunately don't have a name, but the question is, in your research, have you come across any differences in the way military men and women make decisions approaching these conflicts. Is there an anecdotal example that would suggest to you that there is an actual difference in the decision making between military men and women? And then, sorry, I'm just looking again at the list that is still open. And then finally, again, something very different. Adam Roberts is asking about the maltreatment of some prisoners, especially in Iraq. I know you have thoughts on this, Ben, what the lessons are to be learned there about the management of that particular issue, the provision of troops for that purpose, and what kind of training might be required. So let's. I'm sorry, there are a few more out there who I'm not getting to, but let's take that final burst of 4, and you got about 40 seconds on each, Ben.
Great to hear from so many colleagues who are all experts in their own right. The question on counterfactuals, I think I covered one of them. There is a counterfactual in Iraq that 2004, the Shia uprising was defeated, and it was roundly defeated. A sense I have from some US and British military is that if after that defeat in 2004, the US and the British had then surged into Iraq to maintain the stability, but had also surged civilian assets, development and reconstruction, they might have been able to build on the momentum of the defeat of the Shia militias. And I think that's a reasonable counterfactual. I've also done a counterfactual on something called Operation Sinbad in Basra that suggests with more resources and more mobilization, it might have achieved more political success. Paul's question. The sense I have reading about decision-making in Washington, DC, 2002, 2003, is that I'm afraid Secretary Rumsfeld and others of his persuasion were mesmerized by the success of the RMA in Afghanistan. I think there were many US military, particularly US Army people with a lot of experience from the Balkans who felt this was going to be more difficult than Rumsfeld assessed. But I think they and many British military had a mental image that they would be so welcomed that it would be like Kosovo, where initially the NATO troops entering on the ground were treated like liberators in extraordinary scenes. And I think there was a malign effect of many Iraqi exile politicians on decision makers in Washington as well. I think the over-optimism in London has been well covered by the Iraq inquiry. There's a really good story, which does involve some death and wounding, but also involves gallantry medals. A really good story I tell in the book, which I'd like to say more on, of the ever-increasing role of women in the US, British, and NATO militaries. And there was no front line. They increasingly stepped up to the plate. There were gallantry medals won by women in both armies. And it was also discovered that, particularly in Afghanistan, the value of having conversations with Afghan women and female engagement teams were formed. And I'm delighted that one of the pictures we were able to put in the book was an excellent picture of 2 US military policemen in military police women in Afghanistan. And I'm sure this contributed to the US and British military removing all restrictions on the employment of women in their forces subsequently. In my military career, in the British Army, I worked with an increasing number of women as the restrictions were progressively reduced. I never noticed any difference in decision-making. What I did notice, though, that in some roles, if you didn't have a woman on your team, you were at a disadvantage. For example, in human intelligence, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind, and I think this is supported by science, that women can read body language in different ways from men, and they can read it very well. And if a human intelligence team is all male, it's less effective than a human intelligence team with women in it. Professor Adam Roberts' question. I must declare that I'm a qualified interrogator and questioner, and I ran an interrogation centre in Northern Ireland in the early 80s. I think the US and British armies had lost their moral compass to a certain extent. They'd lost sight of hard lessons that prisoners are invaluable sources of intelligence if you treat them right. And they'd lost sight of the need to handle prisoners in accordance with international law and also domestic law. And it was a disgrace. And although there was an effort in the US to hold people accountable, relatively few of those involved were actually court-martialed. In the case of the British abuse of prisoners in Basra, it is astonishing that the inquiry into the death of Baha Musa names so many names of military commanders and also senior officers who were responsible for Britain having an inadequate prisoner handling capability, and they've never been held properly accountable. Mind you, there are other British decisions that were taken in the Iraq and Afghan war for which senior officers have not been held accountable either. For example, the capture of British sailors by Iran in 2007 and the success of the Taliban attack on Camp Levanek bastion in Helmand. And I think, I find this very disappointing, but I think the US Army and the US Marines have been better at holding senior officers responsible than has the Ministry of Defence, the British Army, and the House of Commons Defence Committee. Sorry to end on a negative note.
Ben, not at all. Thank you so much. If I counted correctly, you engaged with about 17 questions, and there are about 10 that I didn't even get to. So that is a very rich menu. We will, I think the tech team can make sure we extract the script, so to speak, from the Q&A file, as there might well be things in there that you want to pick up with the people who ask questions. So hopefully we'll have that opportunity. Ben, thank you so much. I thought that was excellent, and thank you for being so engaging and to the point in your answers. That meant we could get a lot in, and I think it's a testament to the interest that you generated, that we had so much on the Q&A file and so many people wanting to get in. So I recommend the book to all of you, of course. As Ben said, it is currently available at a discount of the publisher's webpage. So go get it for your Christmas table. And with that, we'll close today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this hour. Thank you to Ben for leading such an interesting discussion. And thank you all for your time. Bye for now.